the advisors to the judges. And he says Wechsler and Wright frequently did not see eye to eye, and there was a recurrent line of demarcation which pitted the academics, Wechsler and Wright, that's Quincy Wright,
Yes.
against the younger men, Fisher, Rowe, and Stewart, who had come to Nuremberg directly from military service. The latter group was initially not very tolerant of what they considered Wechsler's and Wright's abstract and academic reservations about summary justice for the Nazi culprits. As the trial wore on, however, the harsh views of the three military men were somewhat tempered, and by the spring of 1946, with their moderation rising, they found themselves in control of the field, since Wright had returned to the United States fairly early in the trial, and Wechsler had gone back to Columbia in April or May of 1946. Even so, Biddle still depended heavily on the advice of Wechsler and Wright after they were in the United States. He corresponded with them on crucial questions, and at least one portion of the final judgment was written by Wechsler. You know how he found that out? I certainly didn't tell him.
That's all accurate. That's accurate.
Yeah.
Can you recall occasions when you would be contacted and why from Biddle after you're back in the States?
Yeah. The most important occasions were when he was trying to figure out how to deal with the charge of conspiracy. And we corresponded. Finally, he asked me to write out what I would say on a number of aspects of that issue, and I did. And part of that was taken from my letter and is in the judgment.
This would be done by mail, not transatlantic phone?
By mail.
Yeah. Can you reconstruct to some extent how Judge Burkett might have commented upon Justice Lawrence?
Well, he'd have been very, very discreet in any public comments or comments.
You're having a drink at the hotel.
Occasion. I can't call any words. The things about Burkett was that he could convey a feeling about it, something, his feeling about something, in very few words, but very effectively. One of the things he used to joke about Lawrence was a certain tendency that the old gentleman had to take automobile rides with pretty girls. I don't think he was a philanderer, but and I don't think Burkett meant to philanderer than to be a philanderer, whether you're a judge or not.
A great deal less risk. But this observation was made about Justice Lawrence's comportment at Nuremberg.
Yeah.
Did you ever see the judge and the Chief Justice in the company of a pretty lady? Was he going for a ride somewhere?
Yes.
You did?
Yeah, sure.
Would these have been British drivers from the Army, like Eisenhower's Kay Summersby?
No. You mean the pretty girl?
Yeah.
No. He had a driver all the time who was a GI.
Male military
Right.
chauffeur. Yeah. That gets me to another question. The administrative operation of a fairly large enterprise, this is like a big company.
That's right.
Is this done by the Americans?
Yes.
All of logistics, the billeting, the meals, the transportation, all the housekeeping that goes with running anything.
That's right.
Done by the
It was
Americans.
done by the U.S. Army.
Yeah.
General, very nice, youngish man, maybe in his 40s, named Mitchell,
Yeah.
who was a brigadier general, and who was lent by Eisenhower to serve as clerk, in effect as clerk of this court, of this military court. He was a good administrator,
Yeah.
and so that we didn't have to knock on doors to get help, administrative help. Otherwise, it would have been hopeless.
Yeah.
We couldn't have done it. What would the alternative have been? For Biddle to set up an organization?
But the point I was getting at is it's not a joint allied administration of the logistics and the housekeeping. It's done by the Americans.
Yes. Well,
You don't have British drivers on one day and Russian guards on the next.
the justification for that, which is very important, is that the whole thing was taking place in the American
Right.
zone.
Yeah, that made it much tidier.
It could not have been that way, except as it was in the American.
I gather there would be little question in your mind as to the superiority of Judge Burkett over Justice Lawrence.
No, that's right. Not to make your question too complicated, that's right. But there were many purposes for which a blander personality was more desirable, in my opinion, and for the post of chief judge. And I'd have been a little bit afraid that Burkett, who was a great cross-examiner as a lawyer, couldn't have withstood the temptation to take over the examination of important witnesses like Goering, for example.
But could the judge question witnesses?
Oh, sure.
That's a distinction from the American procedure.
Well, I don't know that there's any American law that forbids it. And American judges do question witnesses in the course of trial, but the conventions are against it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen often that any protracted judicial questioning occurs.
Did you have any social contact with the chief judge?
With Lawrence?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, quite a good deal. He would invite us to dinner, us being usually Biddle and me, and Parker and somebody else maybe. But it was always on a plane of strict formality. I tell you, I have one story about Lawrence that I think tells a lot about what kind of a man he was. This was at a dinner that he had given, and in this house in which he was billeted, and that house had a pretty good library, and he knew that we were all interested in books, and so after dinner he invited us into the library, and he was really just pulling volumes off the shelves at random, and what he pulled down a book that was really a book about architecture, and one of the houses that was discussed in the book was Monticello, Jefferson's home. And Lawrence was saying that he'd been reading in this book, and he was very much interested in it. And he was interested in country houses. He had a country house of his own, and there was a picture of Jefferson's home in some detail, a photograph, which had caught his eye and interested him, and he opened the book and he passed around the photograph and said, that house very much like a country house that he then described somewhere in England, but said there doesn't seem to be any connection between them. This in the book here belonged to a chap named Jefferson. Well, we all broke out laughing, but he never understood why.
It's a good story.
Chap named Jefferson.
I'm sure you have a standard in your mind of a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Would Lawrence have been of that caliber in your judgment?
No.
Of course, some of the ones we have there are not of that caliber.
That's right. No, but he would not have been at home in a situation where issues of statecraft predominate. I really think that as a criminal court judge, at the trial level was the opportunity that brought out the best of his talents.
While he was perhaps not very dynamic, bland, as you say, did he make any colossal blunders?
No. I don't know of any blunders anyway.
Yeah. What about the British prosecutor, Maxwell Fyfe?
Well, he was also a good friend of mine, based on this relationship. Very good lawyer, excellent cross-examiner, Scottish temperament, tending on a little bit on the dour side. But with humor, and he too had been a politician, been Attorney General, and he ended up as a he was appointed to a hereditary peerage. His son is now sitting in the House of Lords in his place.
Shawcross.
Shawcross was the Attorney General under the Conservative government.
Yeah.
And as Attorney General, he was in charge of the British delegation. So he was the Jackson of the British delegation. And David was the second in command during the end of the Conservative government, but the government turned over. You remember Attlee
Right.
succeeded,
Yeah.
and when the government turned over, this man, Maxwell Fyfe, stepped down from being the head of the British delegation, and that man took his place. Elwyn Jones.
Yeah. Were you a friend of Shawcross's as well?
Yes, but he was my
Yeah.
closest friend,
Yeah.
Elwyn Jones.
Yeah.
And Elwyn Jones just died 6 months ago. He's dead. And Shawcross is still alive. He's resigned from the bar, and he's a lord now, and actually sits in the House of Lords.
Where did you go to?
To City College in
Undergraduate, CCNY. Yeah.
1928 there, and 31 at Columbia.
What's your date of birth?
It was 1909.
What stands out in your memory about Taylor at Nuremberg?
Well, he made, first of all, he made one of the 2 or 3 best presentations of any delegation. He had very hard assignments. He had to prove that the German General Staff was a criminal organization, for example, on which he lost, but he should have lost. But the point is that the presentation was just terrific, and he made it plausible to think that maybe it was.
He put the best possible case forward.
That's right.
Yeah. What kind of a guy is he, or was he then?
Well, he's one of my closest friends. It's very hard to answer that. I suppose the most striking thing about him is that he's a great writer. I mean, his mastery of the English language is terrific. If you look at any of his books, I think you'll be persuaded that they're superbly written. And he has about 4 or 5 books now, and he's about to publish this Nuremberg book. He is a superb lawyer. He was a government lawyer for many years. He's also a member of a law firm in New York. I forget the name of it, but I don't think he does very much there anymore. I persuaded him to go into teaching. He's been a professor at Columbia now for years.
How did you feel about allowing the defendants to select counsel who were Nazis?
Well, I felt that they should be permitted to do that. There was a debate about that, of course. It's not a complicated problem, but so long as they abided by the rules and were not suspected of any type of hostile action, I didn't see any reason why the defendant shouldn't be able to have all the help he could get.
Tell me, what would you like to tell me about Jim Rowe? He was a good friend of yours.
Very close friend.
Yeah.
Well, he you know what his background was, what he did in Washington.
Well, he was in the New Deal, but I'm fuzzy.
Oh, no. Well, he became one of the so-called anonymous presidential secretaries. You remember the time when Roosevelt said that he was going to give himself the assistance. I forget what he said about it, but the point was he didn't want anybody to shoot his mouth off. But Jim was born and raised in Montana. He's very Western in his attitudes and speech. He went to Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and I don't know just how it was that he ended up as a Roosevelt secretary, but I guess he served in the White House for a couple of years, and then he shifted and became an official of the Department of Justice. The office that he held was called at that time the Assistant to the Attorney General, which is to be distinguished from the Assistant Attorneys General, of whom there was something like 6 Assistant Attorneys General, and one the Assistant to the Attorney General. Roosevelt obviously took a shine to him. During his White House period, I think it's fair to say he was engaged almost entirely in political activity and problems. He then went, as I said, from the White House to the Department of Justice when Francis Biddle became Attorney General. I always thought one reason why the President put Jim in that position was that he had more confidence in Jim than in Francis. And he wanted him looking over Jim's shoulder. The other view of that is that he wanted to particularly help Francis get accustomed to government work. I worked very closely with Jim for at least 3 years. I was indeed his first assistant for 2 years. Very sensitive, interesting mind, and devoted New Dealer, but a fellow who also could see the other side of things.
I have a photograph given to me by the woman I mentioned in Mexico, Katie Walsh, who was a very good friend of Jim Rose. And it's the two of them together, and he looks like a very rugged, handsome individual. Was he?
Well, no, certainly not in his last years. He had a cardiac condition that ultimately killed him. But yes, in terms of that's the kind of personality he had. He finally left the government. He joined the partnership of Tommy Corcoran, and he really practiced political law for the rest of his life.
Yeah. Let me mention another name of a guy who's, I understand, was out at the University of Chicago, and ask if you think he would be a good interview. His name is Bernie Melzer. Do you know him?
Yes, I know him. He is a law teacher at the University of Chicago. I can't think of any reason to interview him.
No. About Bernays, I gather...
He's dead.
He's dead. I want to ask you, did you think he was a particularly sharp lawyer?
No.
He just stumbled upon this conspiracy idea?
I didn't think well of his work at all.
Why not?
I thought it was not thought through, frequently ignorant. But I mean, that was a big issue. I took my position on that 40 years ago.
Yeah. was your formal title?
I was principal technical advisor to the American judges.
I'm going to make a layman's observation, and you tell me where I've gone wrong. Correct me, give your view. I have a sense from what I've read so far that the Nuremberg Trial was not particularly great law, but it was pretty good justice.
Well, let me take the second part of that first. I think it was pretty good justice. As a matter of strict law, I think they made only one mistake, and that was in convicting Stryker. Yet I think that Stryker was probably the foulest and most despicable of all those defendants. When I say that he ought not to have been found guilty, I don't think he was guilty as a matter of law of any of the crimes that were charged against him. He didn't kill anybody. Insofar as his anti-Semitic writings are concerned, they may have had influenced some people to be sympathetic to, or even to participate in hostile action against Jews. But the law of complicity requires something more than that conjectural relationship. Indeed, the whole point of the law of complicity is to avoid dragging people into responsibility for other people's crimes on a very slender thread, and particularly when matters of opinion are involved, the law should be very cautious about attributing criminality to the expression of hostility. Now, a lot of people would say that I'm talking in terms that indicate what's wrong with the law, but that is the difference between believing in the strict application of criminal law and assuming that everything that you dislike is a crime. So I feel very strongly about that, and I think that was the main human problem in connection with these prosecutions, to safeguard the process against being merely manipulative and attributing criminality to things because we just greatly hate them. But as I say, I'm speaking in very technical, legal terms. If every time anybody published an accurate description of somebody else as a hateful and despicable person, he was then to be held guilty of any crimes committed against that person by a third person, you would simply have too much of an overlay on speech. And I think people see that, but when they get into political propaganda, they tend to forget it. So I think one of the big things about Nuremberg Trial was that having set out the rules that were to govern in the Nuremberg Charter, so-called, the organic law of the tribunal, that the court actually acted like a court and applied the law as best, with reasonable accuracy and fairness, as I think the court did. I would buy, for example, I suppose Stryker had been taken out and lynched, as he well might have been once the Nazis had fallen. He wasn't even very popular with the Nazis. I mean, he really regarded as a corrupt old man. But I wouldn't have thought that that was a good thing for society to have that happen. And if it had happened through the instrumentality of the Nuremberg Court, I have deprecated it very much. Well, I think if it didn't happen at Nuremberg, it came very close to happening. As I said earlier, I think that's one questionable verdict that the court rendered. These are terribly hard issues to reach a firm conclusion about, and I can assure you that they're awfully hard issues to resolve when somebody's life may turn on how you resolve them. I'd have been a terrible judge in Nuremberg, but I think I was a quite good advisor to Francis Biddle, because I didn't have this sense of responsibility.
As a judge, do you think you might have erred on the side of leniency or punitive attitude?
Leniency.
Yeah. This raises a question I've been wanting to ask you all along. I get a clear sense of you at the time as a young man of law, as being fair-minded, reasonably objective about people and situations. At the same time, I'm assuming you're Jewish.
Yes.
You're in a country which just months before has concluded a war in which, had you been a German, you're very likely they would have exterminated you, your children, your mother, your wife, your brothers and sisters. Did you have any sense of discomfort in being in Germany?
Nightmares.
Nightmares.
Yes, I felt it very deeply, but I remember that this responsibility had come to me not because I sought it, or even because I was specially selected for it, but because it was the only way in which I could do my job, the job in which I was incumbent from an earlier time. So I would have felt that it was craven for me to do what I was greatly tempted to do, namely to decline to participate. I would have felt that it was wrong for me to especially seek out participation, but I'm a jobist first and last, and there could be no doubt that it was my job to do what I did. To do the work that was involved in it. Everybody knew that I was Jewish, and if that had a bearing on the persuasiveness of anything that I said or wrote, they were fully forewarned to discount it for that reason. So I had comfort in my conscience, but I think it may have operated to make me more sensitive to claims that might be put forward by the defendants. It certainly didn't make me have the opposite effect. So I don't think that any German who may have been affected by anything I did can complain that I injured him unfairly. But these are very tough problems of how to, in a judgmental situation, to handle yourself so that, so far as it's humanly possible, you get yourself out of the judgment rather than in it. I had a good chance to compare my reactions to with my colleagues there, none of whom was Jewish. I think that compared to Jim Rowe, for example, a person whom I greatly respected, whose judgment I respected.
Here we were talking about Mrs. Yodel having just arrived.
Yeah. I said that she had turned up at the courthouse and asked for an interview, a chance to talk to the American judge. So, of course, this was duly reported to Francis. He had the good sense for once to decline to see her, but he bumped her off to me, and she proved to be an enormously attractive, really a beautiful woman, and I did see her, and I got Jim Rowe to see her with me. We just took one of the offices and set it up, really, so that it retained, the setting retained a degree of formality that it ought to have had. We also got one of these things going. But she said quite simply that she had walked to Nuremberg because she had no transportation, and yet she wanted to be as close to her husband as she could be and as helpful as she could be. First thing she asked was, how can I help him? And, well, he hadn't yet had a lawyer appointed for him, though in the end, my recollection is that he got a very good lawyer in the person of Dr. Franz Wechsler, who was a professor of law at the University of Munich, I believe. I had known Wechsler from an occasion, and not very long before this, when he had come to Columbia. It really was an academic visit. There was some precipitating occurrence that, but you know, just in the course of an ordinary year at Columbia, both in those days and now, quite a number of foreign law professors will turn up for one reason or another. So when I realized that Wechsler was on the list of German lawyers who were available, I suggested to done as counsel to his lawyer.
Yodel.
Hmm?
Yodel.
To Yodel's counsel, yes. That but he knew him,
He did know him.
and they got him. My recollection is that they got him. He certainly appeared for somebody,
He was Yodel's
He was.
counsel, yes. They became rather close friends.
well, I think they had some start, too.
Yeah. At that occasion, when you first meet Mrs. Yodel, she asks how she can be helpful. Is at that point that you discussed Exner?
No.
No. What did you discuss on that occasion?
Well, we told her, that he would be given the opportunity to choose a lawyer from the list. And when that had happened, the lawyer would undoubtedly need clerical and secretarial help and any other kind of help that she could provide. She ought to stand by and offer her help as an assistant to his ultimately chosen lawyer, an assistant in any way that she could be helpful, and that the lawyer wanted her assistance. And in fact, that's what happened. I mean,
She did.
but it was interesting. They had, though the defendants were told that they should, the military defendants, that they should appear in uniform. But of course, they were stripped of any indicia of rank. And this bothered her very much. He appeared in one of his uniforms without his epaulets, and I take it that that's standard procedure. I mean, the fellow's court-martialed. He's an officer. He has to take off his stars for his. I don't know whether that's our practice. It is not.
No.
I'm glad to hear that. I guess if you're charged as a war criminal, then maybe it is.
I think it was a political or a public relations decision myself. And why should Hermann Goering appear resplendent in his field marshal's uniform at this time? This would be my interpretation. But anyway, I'm curious about this visit. So she expressed her displeasure that he could no longer appear.
No, I mean, she had the sense that he was being degraded, you see. And of course, he was.
Right.
That impressed me very much, so. I mean, the sensitivity of her reactions and the I'm sure, sincerity of her devotion to this man.
This raises an interesting question in my mind. I would think that you and Rowe sitting there and seeing this woman might have been the subjects of two colliding emotions. One would be a natural resentment towards these people. The other would be a basic humanity that all of us feel towards another human being, where I almost feel one might be justified in having Mrs. Yodel show up and ask, how can I be helpful? One might be justified in feeling, we're not particularly interested in helping you. On the other hand, seeing a loyal wife and attractive woman undermines that resentment. Did you feel any of that tug and pull?
I don't think so. We provide counsel for indigent or otherwise incapable defendants. as a routine matter.
No, yeah, I understand that. We're talking here about a regime that.
I mean, it would not have occurred to me to feel that in dealing with Yodel, it should be our objective to make him know how much we hated him.
Yeah. But you could, it's well within your duties not have been particularly helpful to this woman. You were not required to be helpful.
I wouldn't have had much regard for myself if I had responded that way.
That's what I meant by the collision. Well, what does she look like? You say she was a beautiful woman.
I don't think I can describe her. Very regular features, delicate features, dark hair. That's about it.
How old would she have been?
Maybe mid-40s.
This woman has taken a long walk, as you described. Does she look fashionable, or does she look a little dowdy in her dress?
Not noticeably, but she wore an overcoat when she sat with us. It was cold in that courtroom. I don't know really what else to say about her. I think anybody meeting her there would have thought of her as an attractive person.
She certainly sounds like an admirable person.
Nice person. And I would have liked to be helpful to her in any way I could. I mean, I don't think it was quite just a legal aid impulse on my part. On the other hand, nobody could have realized more deeply than I that there was absolutely nothing I could do for her, and that her husband was going to end up on the gallows.
You felt fairly convinced of that.
I felt I pretty well knew that because I knew what the charges were against him.
Let me go down a list of some of the major defendants here, and I'm curious to know if there's anything that stands out particularly in your mind about each of them as I go by, as to something they did, something they said that stayed with you. We'll begin with Goering.
No, I was impressed by his intellect, as everybody was who heard the testimony. But it was no surprise to me that he was a person of high intelligence. I think I knew that just based on what we knew in our country about the enemy.
Is there some kind of perverse sympathy that this man generates by his manner?
It could be. I knew too much about him to have it work for me, but he's capable of genuine joviality. And that's a very ingratiating human trait, which not everybody has.
I was particularly curious about this because I read something that absolutely fascinated me. One of the British officials, when these people were still at Mondorf, had to allow 2 Russian officers to go and talk to Goering. They were going to interrogate him. This is well before the trial begins. And this fellow is very concerned because these Russians are very sullen, grim-faced, and they looked as though they would probably not leave the cell with Goering alive, but he's required to allow them to go in. And much to his astonishment, he's someplace nearby. He starts hearing a little bit of laughter, then a little more laughter. And then he said for the next hour and a half, all he hears is this raucous laughter coming out of this cell. And evidently, Goering had turned on this capacity for what would amount to German good old boy joviality and affability. And I wondered if that came through as you people would watch this man, in effect, perform.
No, and I think one might attribute that in part to his capacity to assume a role in his appearance in court, a role of dignity and importance as the principal surviving high official of the Third Reich. I'm trying to put it in language like the language that he'd have been disposed to use.
Yeah. Anything stick in your memory about Hess? Hess, does anything stand out in your memory?
Oh, well, he just looked like a madman, and I think he was. So, of course, views differed about that. The doctors thought he was mad. Or so they testified.
Von Ribbentrop?
There was something about the expression on von Ribbentrop's face that offended me. Kind of haughtiness, vainglory. I would have thought if looks can mean anything, that he was a quite despicable creature. But just a feeling that I had. Normally, people's appearance doesn't strike me very much either way, but I remember that I did have that sense about it. Dönitz was an impressive man, and he certainly pretty completely bewitched my two principals, that is, both Biddle and Parker.
Really?
Seemed like a straightforward person, a good thinker, and they were both inclined to regard him with respect.
Can you recall an instance, for example, of coming back to the offices after a session of the trial and any remarks that Biddle might have made about Dönitz?
Well, I can't recall any words. We talked a lot about him. things that we as a staff did for our judges was to prepare summaries of all the evidence, pro and con, common for judges to get that kind of help. So it came from the record, of course. Record, 100 volumes. And the summaries, I think, with respect to all the defendants, are among the papers which are available. Jim Rowe and Bob Stewart did most of that work for our delegation. I did a little bit. And if you work through those memoranda, which I imagine you'd be likely to do.
Yeah, I will.
I think you'll find a number of instances where our people were favorably impressed by something a defendant did or said or something about it. Impressed by the extent to which Stewart and Rowe reacted to these people as individuals. I learned something from it. I learned that as a personality, I'm very different from them. I'm a much more abstract kind of character, and I hadn't really realized that about myself until we were engaged in this operation together. I wouldn't have liked to be a criminal court judge for that reason.
You felt yourself more inclined to judge these people on the record.
Well, not only to judge them on the record, but to judge them on abstract legal grounds, and not to permit any response.
Yeah. But these other fellows would be moved one way or another by these people as individuals.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Helpful too, because very commonly what they would say about their reactions would really elucidate the situation.
Did Rader have a similar positive effect on people as Dönitz did? Was he impressive or imposing?
No, I think not. But on the other hand, I think that each of those people would have had something interesting to say about Rader. Particularly about whether he was telling the truth about this, that, or the other thing. Kaltenbrunner, just the looks of him, I think he was, without any doubt, he looked more like a thug than anybody else there in the dock. I think one of the points I make in my own defense is that I really didn't have any interest in these individuals as individuals.
I was reading in Airy Neve this morning about Justice Lawrence, who he raves about. Did you have that same high regard for him?
No, He was not a bright man at all. He was exactly what we thought he would be. A pedestrian English judge. And I think the most predictable of people, quite utterly conventional on everything. On the other hand, he had a certain confidence which he put to good use. And I think when the trial was over, that those of us who were close to it were glad that he had been made the presiding judge and felt that he'd done a good job. I felt that. There was quite a bit of contretemps at the beginning, on the question of who would be the presiding judge. And I think that's a place where I helped by encouraging Francis Biddle to favor Lawrence rather than himself as the presiding judge. It was easy to make the argument. Jackson was doing the prosecuting. Most of the publicity in our country, at least, had centered on Jackson. If we were to add to that, not only were prosecuting the case, but we were judging the case. I mean, it helped to at least maintain at least the illusion of objectivity, to have somebody from another country doing that. I felt that very deeply, and I think I helped to persuade Francis that he would have liked to preside. I mean, from the point of view of his own personal joys in life.
Yeah. How did they arrive at their decisions on each defendant?
Yeah, and no differently than an American jury would have. I mean, by first of all setting the matter up for discussion, and then taking a vote, breaking down the issues to be voted on.
There's 4 counts. There's 4 major counts in each case, right?
Yeah, well, the ultimate vote would be on each count.
Right, so they're voting on each count, and they would just vote.
Well, they talk first.
So they would discuss the evidence. Then, when they voted, did it have to be unanimous on each count?
No. The charter of the court answered that question, but what there were 4 judges voting, and a tie would lead to acquittal.
Ah. Were you staff assistants present during these deliberations?
No.
Just the 4 voting judges?
I wasn't there. I had already come back home. That's when they reached the point of voting on the verdict. But I knew what they were going to do, what our people were going to do. Francis had his own discussions with Parker and the staff. Some of those I was present at, and others not. The point was I had to get back. I'd been away for 7 years, and I was scheduled to start teaching at the beginning of the fall semester, so I had to get.
Did you feel any sense of deprivation at not being there at the final curtain, or were you so eager to get home it didn't matter?
No, I felt some deprivation, but I couldn't resist the date for my return had been fixed a whole year before. They had nobody to take my place. I think on the whole, maybe I regret that I hadn't stuck it out to the end, but not at the cost of resigning from the law practice.
Now, do you know, even though you would not have been there at this point, do you know what were the most hotly argued decisions that these judges are making?
Well, I know some of them. I'm sure that the shocked question, the question of shocked, was probably the largest question, and of course they disagreed on that, and they were they were tuned to.
Two is an acquittal, as you recall.
Yeah, 2-2 was an acquittal. But in the case of Shock, I think everything depended on where the American and British judges would vote, how they would vote. I know that Francis voted to convict Shock.
Excuse me, Burkitt, as the British prosecutor. What sense of him did you have as a...
Well, I got to know him very well. And he was a famous lawyer, as you know, although by this point he had become a judge. He was a charming man, very I think very given to self-dramatization, which is not uncommon among leading lawyers, particularly trial lawyers, which he was. Very engaging mind, a great sense of humor, fine raconteur, and he had a very interesting law practice. He, I think, had been gravely disappointed to have Lawrence picked as the senior, as the British judge, whereas he was only the alternate member. And a couple of drinks in a convivial setting, and you'd learn perhaps more about this feeling of his than you cared to know. But I grew very fond of him. He was lots of fun to be with. And, marvelous voice, diction, a superb memory, particularly for poetry, marvelous capacity to quote a long poem from memory.
Do you remember what poets he liked to spout?
Well, he was very much a Shakespearean more than anything else.